My name is Jennifer Widener. I'm at Princeton University, and I help direct a program called Innovations for Successful Societies. We are here because we were asked, not knowing of the other groups, we were asked to go out and listen. That's what we do. Our purpose is to go capture the experiences of partner country practitioners on the ground. We want to hear what they have to say about what they've done. We then help them share that with one another, and then we hope that we can bring it back to teaching, to scholarship, to the world of practice, maybe in the different organizations represented here. We had two aims. One was to identify how selected governments had successfully addressed a number of the challenges associated with revenue mobilization on the one hand, and in linking health priorities to the budget process on the other. So we have those two endeavors, and we developed cases with respect to 5 countries, both of which had made some important changes, not perfect, nobody ever is, but had succeeded in some significant ways. And we were interested, second, in what their persistent challenges were. And there were important commonalities, both in the steps they took to produce some successes, and also commonalities in the persistent challenges. And in fact, given the themes of the first panel, we're going to be focusing mainly on those persistent challenges in this part of the conversation. So the panel today is going to be, the first panel, we have 2, the first panel is going to focus on domestic revenue mobilization, but specifically on taxes. And it's a slightly wacky panel. We're not going to summarize all the cases. We are going to hand you some cross-cutting data. Pallavi, do we have the cross-cutting materials available? Can we just bring those in? Maybe Jim can. So we have some cross-cutting handouts, so you can get some bullet points about what each country did and with what results. And then I'm going to offer a few remarks and turn it over to some pre-done video that sketches what the key cross-cutting challenges were. Then I had hoped we would hear from one of our colleagues in Uganda. We haven't been able to get her here because of the slowness of the US visa process, with apologies. And we have also not been able to get her through clearly on video. So I'm going to try to channel her, even though that's risky, but I'm going to try to say what she told us earlier, and with apologies to Monica. And then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Salam Fayed, whom I will introduce a little bit later, who many of you know anyway. And he will offer further comments, and then we'll open to a kind of Q&A. I think it picks up on some of the themes that came out of the previous panel. So let me say that when we began this revenue series, we looked for countries that had done a number of things. First, had tried to raise the share of, or the percentage of revenue, tax revenue compared to GDP, had increased absolute revenues in constant terms, or real terms, and who had increased the number of taxpayers. And all of the countries we've looked at have done that in some measure. Some have experienced a little bit of a decline in the most recent years, but they've all tried to do this in some measure. Then we went out to say, all right, what did you do? And we tracked that. And then we turned to some of the persistent challenges and the things they wanted you to know. So let me just begin the video, which sketches this in a little bit more detail and some of the issues that came out of this while we're getting you the cross-cutting materials, and then we'll turn it over to Monica. Let's see if I can get this to go. It's supposed to be going. What is it? That stops it. It does? Okay. There we go.
The search for approaches to these problems requires our collective creativity. First, drawing revenues into a single treasury account is something almost all countries have found important to do. But it is easier said than done. Other government departments or public enterprises often want to hold on to the revenue they collect. Second, as in Vietnam, addressing informality presents hard challenges. The question is how to draw small enterprises, often family establishments, into the tax system without either creating incentives for businesses to remain small or causing hardship for the truly poor. Most countries use some form of presumptive tax, but getting the incentives right is often difficult. Winning tax compliance and creating a tax-paying culture often requires special effort. Most of the countries in this series use both carrots and sticks to induce people and enterprises to pay. Vietnam displayed taxpayer goals at the local level to harness the power of public scrutiny. Rwanda sponsored regular taxpayer appreciation days, competitions to celebrate business compliance, high school tax clubs, advice hotlines, and a variety of other forms of outreach. Third, the challenges are often harder in federal or decentralized systems of government. For example, in Ethiopia, because each region was constitutionally empowered to create its own legal framework, rules sometimes differed from one area to another. The federal government had to assume great responsibility in order to encourage standardization and to prevent taxpayers from being burdened by widely divergent policies and procedures across the different authorities. Furthermore, it had to wrestle with the constant tussle over revenue sharing. Regional revenue authorities complained that the federal government shared only 30% of the VAT revenue it collected from corporate taxpayers with the regions in which those companies were registered. Fourth, while governments may grant tax exemptions for economic development purposes, and sometimes for political reasons, the demand to renew exemptions or to use them more broadly often follows. That creates potential unfairness and causes revenues to lag behind projections. But striking the right balance is hard, as is defending decisions not to renew exempt status. Finally, tax systems rely on information technology. Several of the countries in this series found working with an outside contractor to develop a new information system very difficult. The process was expensive, took a long time, and it was error-prone. Some abandoned the effort and bootstrapped, modifying an existing system so that it would work better, even if it lacked the full functionality the new system promised.
So I'm going to stop it there. This is our first panel participant. Monica Tumukunde is in charge of a very distinctive part of Uganda's Revenue Authority. And I want to say a few words first about the Uganda Revenue Authority and what made it a candidate for this set of cases. Then specifically what Monica's contribution was and some of the interesting challenges that arise from that, not only for Uganda, but for other countries. So Uganda, early 2000s, the Uganda Revenue Authority, the oldest independent revenue authority in Africa, is in trouble. Publicly, highly unpopular. The president has called it a den of thieves. There is a judicial inquiry commission organized to try to investigate why corruption is widespread, why its performance has been very low. Out of that, we see a period of extensive reform of structure and procedure in the period 2004 to about 2014 under Alan Kagina. And lots of changes happened then. There are changes in process. The whole staff has to reapply for jobs. There are efforts to rebuild capacity in a variety of ways. The authority, which had been structured in a very complex way, lots of different grades in the employment hierarchy, but then also organization on a variety of different lines. All that streamlined, Everything is brought together under a few functional categories, and the number of HR levels is reduced. So all of that helps. There are impressive information systems brought in. An e-tax system is created. There's sophisticated customs tracking that begins to get underway in this period and then has come to fruition a little bit later. But in 2014, there's still a problem. And that's that Uganda's tax base is extremely narrow. Very few people are actually paying tax. Uganda has a high level of informality, not too much bigger than that of many other countries in Africa and other parts of the world, not too different from some of the other cases in our set, including Vietnam, but higher. And by informality, we mean not just the poor people who are small farmers or the traders, but also some people who are operating in that legally gray area and who aren't paying tax but are probably a bit wealthier. And the question is, who are they? And so the second period of reform, which is reflected in a second case study in the series, is really about that and how the authority began to try to improve equity and draw more people into the social contract, paying taxes, and getting something in return. There had been outreach efforts to build that social contract earlier, but this had to go farther. So Monica had a hard job. She was given the task of trying to enroll in the body of taxpayers, VIPs, and wealthy individuals, most of whom were not paying tax at the time. I think the estimate was that only a third of lawyers paid, and the level of people who occupied positions on corporate boards was even lower. So the question was how to get them as individuals to pay tax. And she had to figure out how you do this. You'd imagine this is an area where you get a lot of pushback. And so we were particularly interested in how they went about this. And they took a number of steps. I think only 5% of the directors of large companies paid tax at the time. And there wasn't a database that allowed them to try to guess who was likely not to be paying tax. So they went out on Google. They said, okay, here are some pretty famous people. Here are boards of directors, lawyers, others. And we can go out on Google and see what they're up to. And these are people who are likely taxpayers but are not paying. And then they arranged face-to-face conversations to try to persuade them to come into the system. Now, over a period of 2 or 3 years, they then began to formalize this, because you can imagine this could be manipulated. It could run afoul of rule of law considerations. So they said, we've got to formalize the criteria for identifying people who really should be on the tax rolls and aren't. And they developed a set, which I hope I can show you if I can get this to move again. They developed a set of criteria, which will gradually appear here, such as land transaction valued at more than $285,715 over the previous 5 years. That's an indicator. Being a shareholder in a company whose turnover was $14.3 million. They developed a set of criteria. There were some criteria like that, and then some other criteria having to do with purchasing patterns. So as a result of this, within fairly short order, they were able to improve compliance in this group. From about 13%, they improved it up to 89%. Whether it stays there, we will see, but I thought it was a bold effort to try to improve equity, because as you might imagine, a lot of less well-off people were saying, why are we being asked to get taxpayer IDs and to comply when the big people are not? And I thought this was a very bold attempt among the tax authorities we worked with to try to mobilize revenue. There are a number of other changes that the Uganda Revenue Authority introduced in this period as well. They became an active learning tax authority. They mobilized a lot of data to try to understand more about the dynamics of tax payment in the country and how they could reasonably boost their revenues. So this was one case. We looked at several others. The cases should be available out there. And to do this, I think interviewed about 125 people across Ethiopia, Vietnam, Uganda, Rwanda, and Indonesia. And in all of these instances, people flagged to us the persistent difficulties of dealing with decentralization, if you have a VAT or other kinds of tax, exemptions, a real problem to control and to pull back on, but also just technical problems, getting the information systems up and running, and trying to persuade people credibly that they would get something for their tax. So Uganda tried a number of strategies in that regard. Rwanda has gone to greater lengths than any, I think, to do this. But taxpayer appreciation days, job fairs, where with the job displays, you also see information about how your taxes are being used. So people who come to look for jobs are exposed to what government is actually doing with revenues, and trying to create a tax culture that way. So here you see the testing criteria that Monica used, and they did have data on motor vehicles through a linkage in the data system. They had to pass an enabling law for. And then you'll see the table on the improvements in compliance within this particular group shortly. We have a lot of the cases out there and are happy to talk to them, and I hope you all have the cross-cutting material now. But what we'd like to do is turn it over to a discussant, Dr. Salam Fayyad, who was one of your colleagues earlier with the IMF, former Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority and former Finance Minister of the Palestinian Authority. And we have been talking extensively to him as we develop this series, and hope that you too will contribute thoughts about how we could do this better. And we will leave Monica's picture up there, since she is a virtual participant in this. Salam, why don't you join me up here? Turn this over to you. We asked Salam to speak to a variety of the issues raised here. In Uganda, as in the other countries, one of the big challenges is creating a single treasury account, because one of the discoveries was that departments weren't remitting funds to the tax authority or to the treasury. They have to act on that front. You've had experience with that. You've had experience with many of the other elements of this. So I'm going to let you talk about whatever aspects of this you'd like to comment on.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, or should I say Monica, for the latter part. Thank you very much for having me. I first of all would like to thank the Gates Foundation, as well as stakeholders, NYU, Wagner, Princeton University, and ODI. Pleasure to be with you. I'll try to get into some of these issues, but not before saying that I very much enjoyed the first panel, even though I may have missed a little bit early on. And before I get into these issues, let me underscore my full agreement with something that Marco said toward the end, the unsayable or the unsaid, less is more. But more to the point, what was said also about PFM being purposeful, and I like that, to be honest with you, but purposeful PM doesn't go very well with umbrellas. They're certainly not big umbrellas. In my own, even though this issue is not really, I'm not really completely settled in my own mind on how broad or not so broad, but in a preliminary way, if I may suggest, as opposed to a big umbrella, or even small umbrellas or small silos as solution. The distinction between policies on the one hand and implementation on the other, Chinese walls rather than umbrellas, to make this whole area workable, an area of inquiry, and to provide a basis for there to be value added, if you will, to the discourse in this extremely important area of PFM. And I'm really actually grateful that the Gates Foundation found it important to support this kind of work and encourage them to do more. The challenge, I think, for all of us who participate in these discussions is to try to direct it in a way that could produce value added to that which exists. I mean, there's a lot of stuff, multiplicity of players, something was said about institutions. We could come back to those maybe over lunch, but I think this is really a very important discussion. On the issues before us here in terms of revenue administration, what Monica was up to, and speaking of value added, when you go through these cases, I encourage you to at least go through the summaries, actually. You'll be struck by what you see practitioners do, certainly not the kind of thing that technical advisors would really go into these countries and recommend. And maybe that's scoff at being told that someone like Monica, for example, thought of beginning to work on broadening the tax base by going for VIPs and talking to them and all of that sort of thing. A lot of people would scoff at that to begin with. And there are obvious shortcomings. But that's the world of a practitioner. You're there, and most of the time, and the studies cover periods during which countries in question will have been experiencing a financial crisis, looking for whatever way they could to mobilize more revenues, expand the revenue base, broaden it, and go for some additional taxes, and with all the challenges that come with that, beginning with some basic issues in terms of the role of the Minister of Finance in all of this. And not all countries are uniform in terms of where the revenue administration is to begin with. Some of these countries, it's a standalone entity with the Commissioner General, and others, it's part of Minister of Finance. There are different models around the world. But speaking first to the issue of centralization and of treasury operations now, and not revenue, it's absolutely essential. We're talking about public financial reform. A key first step there is for the treasury to be the center of the system to begin with, central treasury that is. And for that central treasury to have a consolidated treasury account to which all inflows, whether domestic revenues, grants, other sources of financing, funding, would be channeled. Otherwise, it'll be very difficult to manage and to have elements that relate to what you need to have ultimately by way of transparency and accountability. And something was said about, I think Florence made the point about accountability, and maybe that's what's been missing, as a matter of fact, and it could explain to a large extent why various forms, various efforts at effecting reform in many of these countries, whether the ones we're looking at or others, actually failed. Experience has not really been very good, something that my former employer, as well as the World Bank, would not be very happy with, but I think they would readily concede. It's a fact of life that some of these countries have been adjusting and reforming for decades, which by itself is an admission of failure of immense proportion. Key reason why that happens, as a matter of fact, is that reforms do not tend to be deep enough to actually get to the contestability issues, or what I really would like to describe as politically transformative reforms. In other words, the reforms do not really get into the area where they really begin to influence the work processes in a way that could actually begin to really strengthen institutions and institutional processes and what have you. So central to the effort going forward, as a matter of fact, for any Minister of Finance is to ensure that they really have that kind of centralization. I would not really get too much in detail on that, but insofar as revenue administrations are concerned and their relationship with the Treasury and with channeling the revenues they collect to the Treasury, there are some models where some countries, and some of the cases actually that are in the case studies, where they found it useful to keep, or important for their own operations, to keep part of what they collect for their own operations. Sounds logical, particularly, as I mentioned to you, in these cases, typically the situation is one of dire financial crisis, and Minister of Finance is, to say the very least, not regular in terms of transferring the funds that get to it in a timely fashion to line ministries, and including agencies of government, including revenue administration function. So because they tend to be underfunded, they find it necessary to keep part of what they collect to ensure that their operations run smoothly. I guess, I'm kind of really conflicted on these issues in some ways. I mean, between, what's fundamentally sound and what I know life in the trenches to be like. I certainly can relate to the commissioner to the extent there is such a position of revenues, kind of really saying, how are we going to really collect if we do not have money to run our own operations to begin with? So we need to be funded. And the Minister of Finance so broke, they're, to say the very least, not regular when it comes to transferring funds that are necessary. And when they do, it's often not adequate. I'm conflicted because I see the logic of it. I see the compelling logic of it, particularly in situations where you do not have adequate institutional processes or work processes, for that matter, that are reliable, that have been deeply entrenched with norms that are respected by everyone. At the same time, it runs counter to basic precept of sound public finance management. And you do have a situation like this. This runs counter to the principle of centralization, that the Treasury should really have all of the funds, and then it should transfer funds it collects from all sources as a charge against an approved budget to the various agencies of government, including revenue administration. So that's what good practice is, but that's not what happens sometimes. I can't really put myself in position of really saying with strength what officials should do or should not do. They have countries to manage, and the dictates of the crisis and the situations that these officials find themselves in require that they really act outside the box. But at some point, I think it's really important for countries, for reasons including those you alluded to, related to rule of law issues and how things should happen, to begin to, as soon as possible, institutionalize various public finance processes and procedures in a manner that is compliant with some set of laws and rules and regulations. Key amongst which would be to really have all of the revenues channeled first to the consolidated treasury account, and then to receive it as a charge against the budget. One obvious downside to kind of living too long with a model where the revenue administration keeps part of what it takes is that, what do you say to the Minister of Health? Minister of Health also is in the business of at least overseeing, if not really actually providing, certainly primary care, to say the least, and more than that in many countries. What are you going to say to them if you allow revenue administration to retain part of what they collect? Why not the Minister of Health? Why not allow the Minister of Health to retain part of the fees they collect? Because they do collect some fees. What about Minister of Education? What about Minister of Housing, Public Works? And you go down the list. And before you know it, what really starts out as a logical exception, because this is really the revenue administration, all of a sudden you have a process of proliferation of a practice, which, while understandable, I think runs you deeper and deeper in trouble and makes it more and more difficult for you to, at some point, get to the point of centralizing and consolidating. It makes it more difficult when you do that. And when you get to that point, and this is especially to the practitioners who are Minister of Finance or with Minister of Finance background, they can relate to this a lot. When you get to the point of doing this, I mean, you really have to be dealing with colleagues who actually, you're going to negotiate with them. And just like you're negotiating with VIPs to really include them in tax base and whatnot, you definitely need to negotiate with your colleagues. So if you are a Minister of Finance and you go to various line agencies and you say all of the revenues you collect first have to come to me, to the Minister of Finance, before you see some of them again as a charge against an approved budget, you need to make sure that they are able to run, however minimally, while you're really finding your way. So a key thing to really keep in mind when you really get to the point of actually taking the decision to consolidate and to begin to act on it is, as a matter of fact, to ensure that these various agencies are adequately, however minimally, funded, because otherwise there'll be a lot of pushback against what otherwise is a drive for reform, for introducing an important public finance reform, this being centralization. So ministers of finance and officials, senior officials are fond of saying this is what the book says, but they do not sometimes pay enough attention to the need to ensure that their path to getting there is not as so difficult as to certainly create scope for pushback and maybe even reversals that could really affect other elements of reform as well. I found a lot of what Monica had to say and what her experience extremely relevant. And as a matter of fact, this case, as well as other cases, provide a very good example of how this kind of work can actually bridge an important gap between the ideals, between the advisor's ideal, if you will, and the practitioner's work. Body of knowledge that really actually, state of knowledge that forms in the process of really doing this, by focusing on work processes, adds important value to the work that is routinely done by international financial institutions, especially the World Bank and the IMF and some others, as a matter of fact, but mainly these two. Because typically, as I said, these institutions tend to get involved in developing countries, time of crisis, and no time to really be thinking strategically, strategy for this, strategy for that, although some of this is done in a hurry. But in the rush to really get it done in time for a donor meeting or something like that, there's very little attention. Very little attention goes to the how of things, the process. What was the word of a practitioner like? I mean, how much can you, realistically, as a mission for either one of these two institutions, how much time, realistically, can you spend in a country, in a crisis situation, when you're preparing against the dictates of a deadline and all of that, the donor conference that's coming, inadequate work processes in the country you're in, headquarters to report to, and et cetera. How much time do you really have to get into the word of the practitioner and to really understand the real constraints? This is also another area, another space that I think value can be created and added most usefully. Sometimes, I'm former this, former that, former the other thing, and I guess when your titles have too many formers, you're in trouble, I guess, or not so, because you can speak freely. I cannot tell you how, I cannot say enough as to how important this is and how little of it is really and deeply or adequately understood at the level of IFI. So this is very important work, to really give these officials a chance, tell a story. What is it that they really encountered? What was it like when Monica negotiated with the VIPs? The setbacks, and what were the inadequacies? You said 2-3 years down the road, some of the downsides started to materialize, and obvious conflict with the issues and all of that. Very important to know. No one is doing that. IFIs do this kind of work, but not regularly in the context of case studies from time to time. But this is very, very important and useful. On the centralization-related issue of autonomy of the tax administration, and again, different countries have different models. But as part of the autonomy, central bank, Freudian slip, because I was going to say something about central banks as well. Revenue administration will come to you and say, we are your kind of collector. Without us, you really cannot do anything. We collect the revenues. How can we possibly do it when we have staff that is not adequately motivated, that they have to worry about making ends meet, the low pay, essentially. So as part of the autonomy, and this could happen under either system where the tax administration is autonomous, or even when it is an organ of a bigger structure like Ministry of Finance or something like this, where government makes a decision, there is lobbying for this, and the decision is made to grant the employees of that particular agency, revenue administration or something like that, a higher pay, or to have a different pay scale for them, or something like that. I'm conflicted on this issue as well. And I really say this with absolute humility, because I know there is absolute logic to this, if you really can think about it. I mean, if you really think about it and take time to understand, the real predicament here. You cannot but really sympathize. After all, you have these tax assessors, I don't want to say collectors now, you have these tax assessors dealing with millionaires and VIPs and things like this, and with bankers, and very sophisticated and all of that sort of thing. You need for them to really have adequate technical skill and expertise to really be able to figure out where the pitfalls are and whether they're really getting the real story or not the real story. And to, as much as possible, also shield them from the temptation of corrupt practices, which is very common. So with all humility, I can tell you, I'm deeply conflicted on this. On the one hand, I fully understand it, fully understand it. But on the other, there are obvious downsides to this. I said central bank, Freudian slip, because central banks in various countries tend to have this sort of thing, that we're the central bank, and so we have to have something. With modesty, I propose that maybe two things I would say on this. It's an aspect of much bigger problem. The pay in civil service in developing countries generally tends to be low, extremely low, as a matter of fact. Partly because of two things. One, early on, and this is probably a gross generalization, but I know it applies across many countries in immediate aftermath of colonialism, in the post-colonial days, countries started to hire and recruit people, right, left, and center, bloated bureaucracies, and all, for a variety of reasons, they got into financial difficulties, they were unable to really keep pace with inflation and things like this. Some of them then they really had trouble of course, they borrowed extensively, and then they came to the verge of bankruptcy. They went to IFIs and rescheduled their debts. And a common feature of adjustment programs was a commitment that was uploaded year in, year out by IFIs, by the authorities, to hold the line on the wage bill. Which included, importantly, pay freeze on wages and salaries. So when that happens, you run it 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and all of a sudden, you have disaster, where you have a little bit of an adjustment in wages that can keep your budget within the realm of sanity, definitely nowhere near adequate. So there is this problem. So as part of really of dealing with this is to forget about this policy of, say, the freeze on anything, to be honest with you. It's not really good policy long term. It leads to these problems. Now, what do you do in the meantime? I would, as a matter of fact, look at functions and look maybe at the civil service code. And as opposed to saying those who work in tax administration are subject to this code of payment, and those who work in other places have a different code, do a code by functionally, as opposed to where you are geographically in a system. So an accountant is an accountant, whether they are in central government, whether they are Minister of Finance at large, whether they are revenue administration, whether they are in Minister of Health or anywhere, something like this, and see what you can do with that. But it seems to me, again, much like the centralization, if you were to really grant an exemption here, there's no safeguard against proliferation. My last point relates to what I said last about the caveats, shielding against the vagaries of corrupt practices. I honestly do not know when it really comes to this whether any amount of money or any amount of pay is going to really be adequate to shield people completely from, that temptation, given the massive amounts of money that are involved and all. I could go on this, but you mentioned some other issues which I really like to comment on, like holidays and exemptions and things like
The
this.
holidays and exemptions one is a big one. What I would suggest is if we could come back to you on that, because I suspect other people
Sure.
might have views on that one too.
Sure.
So you've pointed to a number of areas that we have seen in these cases where there's tension between two completely legitimate institutional objectives. There are also procedures that may have some normative content to them, but I think more often it's this tension between two things we want to accomplish and they work in slightly different directions, and we have to figure out how we're going to make them work a little bit more compatibly. Let us open it to questions, because I'm mindful of the time, and then come back to the exemptions issue if somebody else hasn't brought it up already. And I think there are people coming down the sides with microphones. Anybody want to comment? If not, we will open the exemptions issue. So let me say that across these cases, Vietnam has experienced a real problem in trying to boost tax revenues because so many exemptions have been granted. The same has been true in some measure in Ethiopia, but also in Uganda, a little bit less so in the Rwanda case, and very much so in the Indonesia case. So on the one hand, you want to be able to attract businesses, maybe from abroad, not always from abroad. You want to be able to grant some relief from taxes, maybe as a way to do that. But it sets a precedent. And this becomes extremely difficult to manage. And I'll turn it over to you, because I know you have real experience of this.
Yeah, actually, this is an area where it's prevalent. Wherever you look, it was a fashionable thing for countries to have, and there was always lobby for something that's called encouragement of investment law of sorts. Different names, but essentially what it is about tax exemptions, holidays, and what have you, under the rubric of let us try to create an environment that's conducive to attracting investment, both domestic and foreign, in more recent years. But proliferation of such laws and regulations and all. None of these issues are really straightforward. And again, fully understand where people come from, but when you look at the actual experience with this, it's troubling from the point of view of revenue collection, making enough revenues, fiscal sustainability, and what have you. And in my humble opinion, the downside associated with having these laws and these kinds of exemptions and holidays, the downsides by far exceed any potential upside that may be there. And as a matter of fact, formal jury on this is still out as to what the extent to which exemptions of this kind play a role in actually mobilizing investment resources. There are a zillion other ways in which governments can invest that could really make their countries better domain for investment and better destination for investment, both domestic and foreign, if they were to really be serious about them. Good governance, rule of law issues, by far, in my view, outweigh considerations that may derive from a tax exemption here or a holiday there. They create massive holes in revenue. They are grossly unfair. They tend to favor actually large operators and as opposed to the small ones. And I'll have to make sure I remember to say something about the informality and informal sector and presumptive taxation and all. And they're very difficult. They tend to be self-perpetuating. So you go in countries tend to tell you, oh, but this is your exemption is only for 10 years or 5 years or 3 years and it's run out. I just don't know if it is at all possible. I know every 4 years in this country, there's always a debate and about the tax code of sorts, and people are talking about closing loopholes. I don't know for how long they've been doing it, and they'll be doing it forevermore. Loopholes, by definition, are there, and they're going to be. When you plug them, you create some new ones. By definition, I mean, it's just a constant of nature. Operators tend to find ways around the system to make those benefits, quote unquote, kind of perpetual in a way, by having a new investment, for example. They say, oh, we ran out, but then here is a new investment for this, but it qualifies. So as if we have set up something new, and it goes on forever.
So,
And you end up before.
this, and this is a common theme among these countries. And then you began to talk about the additional theme that runs across the cases, which is informality. And almost every country has a presumptive tax. And they've wrestled with the incentive problems embedded in some of these presumptive taxes.
Yeah. Again, in the race, to borrow from the previous panel, in the race to really get more revenues, governments tend to do two things. One, on sometimes, most of the time, recommendation by IFI, especially the IMF, to set up something they call large taxpayer unit, LTU, where you have all of these people, one-stop shop, and so it makes life easy for them and the rest of it. Again, it sounds logical and all, and if you really actually look at it, you would see the rationale that's really given for this is that, 60 or 70% of the tax take comes from these companies. So it really makes sense for us to really have one operation. What is often not looked at is what happens over time after you really do this, as a matter of fact. That ratio actually tends to rise, not fall. And the reason that happens is that it comes at the expense of ignoring those who are not in the large taxpayer unit. And if you really think about it, by definition, if it's large taxpayer unit, it's a service for large taxpayers who are a lot easier to audit and to ensure compliance from than the small informal operators here and there. So chances are, with a little effort, the revenue administration was going to really be able to collect from them anyway. To be honest with you, one way or the other, going to collect from them. So you keep running your system in this fragmented way, compartmentalized way. I can see that it makes life easier for the larger operators and all that sort of thing. But it tends to come at the extent of continuing to ignore or not think strategically about broadening the net and continuing to resort against, because you're really running to ensure that you have no financing gap or something like this, raise revenues however which way you can do it. Arbitrarily saying, for others, we have this kind of we're presuming this amount of money you have to pay. When are they really going to mature? When are they going to really be brought into the fold? I mean, so again, there is something for it, but then one really needs to look at strategically. And I think the sooner you move in the direction of not having this or relying excessively on this kind of fragmentation, the better. Relying, among other things, along the way, take the experience of Rwanda, for instance. I was most impressed by the fact, for example, that they had this business of PR and trying to promote it and celebrating Taxpayer Day. It's a really good thing to do that for two reasons. One, the obvious, involving people and that. Less obvious, actually, is something that goes to the heart of what really gets practitioners to think about having to do things right in the first instance. If as you put together policies and as you think about ways in which those policies are going to really be carried out, if part of your thinking early on, so you're a person of strategy, you're thinking that there's going to have to be an outreach or a PR campaign. And if you know anything about PR, for it to be credible, what you're going to be promoting has to really make sense. And this forces you to think better and harder about that which you're proposing in the first instance. So it really has the added advantage, thinking about outreach has the advantage, added advantage, of getting policymakers to think harder about getting it right in the first instance, because you really cannot go on misrepresenting, over-representing, overselling something that doesn't really have value. These are, I think officials would find it advantageous to think in terms of issues like this, a lot more so than you would find from a longer-term point of view, initiatives like large taxpayer unit and things like that. I mean, that's at least my take on it.
Thank you. Open up to questions one more time, and if I don't see any hands, I'm just going to make one more comment on the presumptive tax. So one of the things that we discovered is that, and I'm sure all of you tax experts, I'm not one, would know about this, but depending on how you define or the incentive system here, you can actually push many of your businesses to become lots of small family businesses rather than perhaps a more efficient larger business. And Indonesia has wrestled with that to some extent. I think Vietnam has struggled with that too. That's perhaps been less true in the African cases we've looked at so far, but it may be on the horizon. And I think that's an area where, too, we could perhaps develop a little bit more wisdom out there than we have to date. Any questions? We've been running this more as an interview. Yes.
Yes, well, first I would have to agree very much. I'm sorry, I'm Jackie Coolidge, formerly of the World Bank. I would have to agree, first of all, that the various exemptions and investment incentives have gone, way overboard and have become really a terrible danger in most countries in the world. Similarly, it is a similar problem with the informal small businesses and their presumptive tax regimes and the incentives then to stay small. I think that part of what we have seen as an absolute necessity is making sure there are no absolute exemptions, like a tax holiday that allows you even to get away with not filing, or similarly presumptive regimes that somehow allow a small business to avoid almost all interactions with the authorities. I think in terms of the incredible need for information and data sharing, we have to absolutely avoid a situation where anybody who should be a taxpayer is ever allowed to get away with not filing on a regular basis. And yet we have seen this as a problem at both ends of the spectrum. The tax holidays that are overly generous in some countries for large investors or foreign investors, and the presumptive regimes that allow small businesses to escape any interactions. It will always lead to bigger and bigger and bigger abuse.
Can I comment on this? Yeah, just to try to reinforce it as a matter of fact, and on the issue of information sharing, which again, I said it's policymakers will find it a lot more profitable to really actually look into ways to broaden the tax base and all of that than to really engage in some of the more classical ways of doing things, which have shortcomings, including what you, Jennifer, said about the tendency for this to kind of keep the system fragmented and compartmentalized in ways that really ultimately lead to an erosion in the tax or revenue GDP ratio. I mean, that's what happens. You ask yourself a question, if you really look at a typical profile of typical adjusting country, I mean, you really think about it, it's really incredible. 30, 40 years have been adjusting, and still, and adding to the revenue base every year, and still revenue GDP ratio is 22%. How does that happen? Precisely for reasons including the ill effects associated with measures taken in the first instance. You tend to end up having less as opposed to actually more, or less lasting or sustainable improvement. On information sharing, I think this is really, there is incredible potential there. There are some questions. There's some obvious, easy ones. There's no issue, for example, going, if you are the tax administration, I'm sure you know from your experience with the bank, you advised on this and all, to go to financial institutions. I mean, financial institutions are good source of data on people. You want to make sure everybody files. And again, voluntary schemes and all are really great, but you said carrots and sticks. Information sharing is basic for the purposes of having sticks. What kind of sticks, though? There we get into issues of individual freedoms and liberties and all. Some issues are less tricky than others. Financial institutions, no problem, for example. But there, you need to worry about this intermediation. For example, the tendency on the part of people, if they really figure that this is really going to be a source of information on them to minimize the use and all of that, which has its own side effects. So it's very important to be working on the carrots and sticks at the same time, similarly, to look for gaps. I'm not really saying don't do it, you do it, but you really have to be mindful of the possibility that it's causing a leakage. Again, loophole here and loophole there. But sometimes we tend to really get carried away. I mean, the practitioners get carried away. There are levers of power. You want to really make money, and you know for certain some people are evading taxes and some are underpaying. So you really can really feel even sense of moral authority to really want to do this. Doesn't really matter how you get to do it. That's, I think, where it's a slippery slope, because you can easily find yourself, because you are in government, having access to instruments of power that can turn into instruments of oppression of your own people. And this is a no-no, I think. For example, just to really make concrete out of this outlandish assertion that I have just made. Governments, for example, sometimes say, all right, we want to really help out our revenue administration, ensuring that it's collecting all the money it needs to collect. So anyone who really wants a government service of any kind would really need to go to the revenue administration, produce a certificate signed on to by the commissioner or somebody, saying you are on good terms with the revenue administration. All right. I mean, I can tell you this is incredibly potent. I mean, this definitely would immediately increase your yield substantially. Question is, how far do you go? Governments in developing countries are a source of many, wide range of services, as they are in other countries around the world. Do you really require it in connection with the provision of any service, like a birth certificate, for example, death certificate? I mean, it's too much. So there is that. Banks, yes. Financial institutions, yes. Other means of really trying to get to taxpayers, one needs to really be careful. Make sure that there are adequate safeguards, because ultimately, trying to really raise revenues in a context of a government that's really becoming more and more oppressive of its own people is going to backfire. It's not sustainable. And again, I go back to sustainability and importance of looking at public finance reform and PFM generally as instruments of improving governance, meaning interaction relationship between government and citizens.
Thank you. So I understand we're up against lunchtime, so you can carry on this conversation at lunch. And some of you, we are going to try to nab you from lunch, take you in for 5 minutes and interview you about some topics at which you are expert and some of us are not. So thank you very much if you've agreed to participate in those, or if somebody comes up to you and asks you to participate in those, we'd be most grateful for that. But I want to thank Salam Fayyad for his trenchant comments, and Monica, who I wish could have been here, and we could not get that visa through in time. So I apologize for that. But thanks very, very much.
Thank you, John.